If we have an economic policy that doesn't challenge inequality, that doesn't challenge the low levels of taxation of the very wealthiest and the tax evasion and avoidance of the biggest corporations, the reality is we're propping up the wealthy in our society, we're propping up that inequality. So it's my plea that I want to see a different society, I want to see a fairer society.
Extraordinary, isn't it, the effort that, first of all, any refugees willing to go to, particularly in light of the Afghanistan crisis, what these people are fleeing, what they're prepared to experience and come to the UK, and the way we treat them doesn't match up to that.
Yeah, then the government and others sort of ritually get up and blame people traffickers. Well, I'm not here to defend people traffickers any more than you are, but we've created a market for them. And I just remember a young Afghan guy turned up in my office one day, and his English was not too bad, and so I said, come in, sat down, and he looked a bit sort of shell-shocked, and so I said, are you okay? He said, well, I've only just arrived. I said, arrived from where? He said, don't know. What do you mean, don't know? He said, well, I came in this lorry and it dropped me in Finsbury Park. He didn't know where he'd got in the lorry. Somewhere, presumably France or Germany, and he didn't really know where he was or what he was doing, and somebody had sort of posted him towards my office, said, oh, go see Mr. Corbyn, he'll help you out. Well, obviously we did, of course, that's what you do, but and then I said, tell me about your life. And he just said, it was horrible, I had to escape, it was dangerous, and then he managed to, I think, get to Iran, but I'm not really sure. He couldn't really remember where he'd been. And just traumatised. And it'll never leave him. That's the story of the 21st century.
Yeah, it's really quite damning. And just in terms of policy, I know it's an emotional story and the suffering that these people go through is really quite alarming, but what is it that, in your view, that the British government should be doing right now that they're not?
Well, first of all, withdrawal was never going to be easy, that I get, but the incompetence and the chaos surrounding it is horrific, and they could and should have done far better on that, on getting that. But the other side of it is they've run out of Afghanistan, there's a food shortage, a medicine shortage, the schools are closed. It doesn't say very much about 20 years of Western occupation. The country that was supposedly the object of nation building is now in the state that it is in. And by whatever negotiations have to take place, we've got to get food and medicine there quickly, as we do in Yemen. I mean, the social crises in Yemen, in Afghanistan, to some extent, slightly lesser extent in Iraq, is there and very serious, ditto in Syria. And it is surely about making sure the basics are done.
It's extraordinary that the British government is cutting international aid at this time, and particularly in relation to Yemen, as you're saying, selling weapons to Saudi Arabia at the same time.
We sell weapons to Saudi Arabia and then wonder why Yemen gets bombed. Well, hello, they've got Made in Britain on them, they've got little Union Jacks on them. And whilst of course I support aid going to Yemen to deal with cholera and all that, of course I do, we all would. It's not the point. The point is, why is it in the mess it is? Yemen wasn't always a devastated, poor country. Yemen wasn't always in this situation, and it is again part of a proxy war that the West are trying to build up. And so there has to be a political process across the whole Middle East, which includes Palestinian recognition, it includes engagement with Iran on human rights as well as everything else. And indeed, I was on a delegation to Iran before I became leader of the party, and I was the one on the delegation who made myself very unpopular because I raised human rights at every meeting. Yeah, with the Iranian government, and I said, "What are you doing? This is not acceptable." And at the end of it, they said, "Well, what's your answer? Because all you're doing," he didn't mean me personally, what all you, the West, are doing is putting sanctions against us and preventing us from trading and all that. He said, look, we will engage on human rights when you engage on trade. And now, I don't like the trade-off any more than anyone else does, but surely to goodness there has to be a pressure on all these issues, and you don't get it by threatening to kill people and bomb people.
Realpolitik, isn't it? Where do you think the opportunity to capitalise on xenophobia, I'm talking about the actions really here of the Conservative government and the way they inflame the discussion around this. What do you think the culture is that creates an environment where they're able to do that? Is the media responsible? Is it there presenting something latent in the British public? What is it?
It goes back a long way. It is the perceptions of world and perceptions of history that our children learn. Listen, I remember as a sort of 8-year-old at school being shown a world map with lots of pink on it. And they said, "This is ours." What? And then they showed us where Britain was on the world map. And here's me thinking, that's a bit odd. You know, Britain's a bit small. And what are we doing controlling all these places? And then you begin to sort of understand that this stuff had been drummed into people from a very long time ago. And if you read a school book of the late 19th, early 20th century, you make your hair stand on end. Open, total racism towards people in Africa, South Asia, etc. And that has a long-term effect. And so it is about concepts of world and concepts of history. And so, I mean, you could look at Africa in a lot of ways. In a quite simplistic level, you could say to children, well, here's a map of Africa. You say, okay. And look at all these straight lines. And then you look at a map of Europe and you find the borders go like this. Yeah, you say, what's that about? Well, it was, in this case, it was Congress of Berlin. But, you know, it's the same point. And that was the West just dividing it all up. Dividing peoples, dividing languages, etc. So that leads you into a discussion. Now, the best way of teaching history is not by giving facts, it's by inspiring your students to want facts.
Absolutely.
So essentially, teach themselves.
If you were able to have an input on the lessons that children learn, what do you think is the most valuable that they could, or is it an attitude, is it a certain piece of knowledge in your eyes?
I don't think there's any one piece of knowledge. I think it's more like an attitude and a respect for the history of other places. I mean, our children are brought up to say the Roman civilization was great, the Normans built great cathedrals, the Tudors did all kinds of wonderful things, the Victorians were utterly brilliant. When do our children get taught about the achievements of the architecture of Benin, or of Great Zimbabwe, or of the Valley of Mesopotamia, or of the pre-Aztec monuments in Mexico, or the Inca Empire in what is modern-day Peru and Bolivia? That comes to a small number of people lucky enough to get to A-level. If we just had, quite a nice thing to do would be sort of monuments around the world. You have Cambodia, you have Stonehenge, you have the pyramids at Giza, you have the pyramids in Mexico. That's a good start. Compare these.
Our understanding, I think, of our history and where we come from is often the same place, I think, is alarming. Jeremy, it would be remiss of me not to ask you about the broader topics at Labour conference. And, you know, we are not within the conference proper itself, we're at the World Transformed.
Very nice too.
Yes, lovely to be here. You wrote in your column for the newspaper recently that the current Labour leadership props up the wealthy. Would you be able to elaborate on that point for me?
If we have an economic policy that doesn't challenge inequality, that doesn't challenge the low levels of taxation of the very wealthiest and the tax evasion and avoidance of the biggest corporations, the reality is we're propping up the wealthy in our society. We're propping up that inequality. So it's my plea that I want to see a different society. I want to see a fairer society. And to slightly misquote Bernie Sanders, who said, America's great and America can afford anything and do anything around the world, but it cannot afford inequality. And the same applies here. If we want a national care service, we don't need to mess about with raising national insurance contributions, which adversely impact particularly on indebted graduates. Instead, we need to have a tax on wealth and, I think, a windfall tax on those companies that have made a shed load out of COVID. And so, unless we have an economic strategy which is about redistribution and empowerment and public ownership, and campaign on it, not just in the 3 weeks of the election, but all the way through, as John McDonnell did from 2015 onwards, we'll begin to change attitudes and minds. And I've never quite forgotten the revelation of one Saturday morning reading the Financial Times. It's my dirty secret. I read the Financial Times every Saturday morning, the weekend FT. They said some credit must go to Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn for changing the whole debate on austerity economics.
Hopefully your legacy is a little bit more substantial than that, Jeremy. Just
2 lines in the Financial Times.
Yeah, exactly. My final point to you, obviously the Joe audience is slightly younger, and you mentioned the national insurance hike there. We're also now seeing an announcement about early repayment of student loans. It might be a bit of an oversimplification, but when you see these kind of policies coming through, Zara Sultana described it to me earlier as a generational issue, and I might go as far as say generational warfare. Do you think, well, where can young people find hope, and do you think that they're specifically being targeted by the current government?
Well, Zara's absolutely right. Young people get what? Now, about half young people go to college or university. Some do apprenticeships and so on. And so that means that roughly half the population in future is going to have some kind of educational debt. And some of them are massive, 50,000, 60,000, that sort of thing. And they're then being told they've got to repay that sooner, a debt that was privatised and sold off to debt collectors. They're then told they've got to pay more in national insurance in order to pay for care for a predominantly ageing elderly population. They're then being told they cannot have the final salary secure pension schemes that my generation has had, and they've got to invest in a private pension scheme, some of which are dubious and insecure, and that the state pension scheme will not be able to support them. So on top of that, they're being told there's no chance of getting a council house because there aren't enough being built. So unless you have a substantial family in very special needs, you're not going to get a council place. And you're not saving enough to buy anywhere because you're paying so much in private rent. Quelle surprise, young people feel pretty angry about the way in which they're going on. And so the whole pitch that was put by Democratic Socialists of America and what we've put and what the youth movements in Europe are putting is, let's turn the dial and make the world fit for the next generation. So Zara is spot on. And if I may say so, what a brilliant voice she is. A young woman in her 20s with her head very firmly screwed on who can absolutely analyse and even better articulate these issues. Thank you.
I promise it's the last question. Do you think that there's a place for those young people who want to see change, they want to see a hopeful future? Do you think there's a place for them in Keir Starmer's Labour Party?
It's not Keir Starmer's Labour Party, it's the Labour Party. I've been in the Labour Party since 1966. England hadn't won the World Cup when I joined the Labour Party, and the whole country celebrated when England won the World Cup a few months later. And nobody owns the Labour Party. It's a party that was created by the sacrifices of a lot of heroic, unknown people all over the country. We have to have things that bring us together, which is why I founded the Project for Peace and Justice as a place for people to come together, in or out of the Labour Party. Obviously I'd prefer in or out of the Labour Party, but above all, it's a place that they can come together, and we're doing campaigns on media, on environment, on economic justice and international solidarity.
Jeremy Corbyn, thank you very much for your time, I really appreciate it.
Sorry about my lengthy answers.